Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Rosner. Very excited for this conversation because on the 1st of March 2021, we signed the Men's Pledge. This is from CariMAN, the Caribbean Male Action Network. On the 26th of April, we would have spoken with our line minister, Minister Simon de Nobrega. And today, the 6th of August, we are speaking with none other than Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi about his decision to sign the Men's Pledge. Welcome, AG. How are you doing?
Very good to be with you. Thank you so much for being a part of something which is extremely close to my heart, front and center of my legislative work, along with my colleagues who produce such awesome coordination at the Office of the Prime Minister.
And with that in mind, it's one thing to say, okay, well, you're pursuing this in a professional sort of manner, AG. But what was your decision, your personal decision? What went into that to say you're taking the pledge on a personal basis?
I'm the son of an extremely strong, fighting type of human being. That's my mother, Diane Sukaran. I am a twin, most people don't know, to a twin sister. I'm married to an extremely powerfully strong woman. And I have two beautiful daughters and a son. And my daughters are fighters for everything that is right in terms of equality and management and protection. So coming from the very family that I come from, having served in society the way I have, this is an issue that is extremely close to my heart. I witnessed my mother, when I was a child, step outside of her car as my sister and I were literally about 6 years old. And my mom jumped out of the car and intervened in an incident which was going on where a man was literally beating a woman on the street. And I saw my mother involve herself in physically parting that man and in then taking him on with the assistance of San Fernandans who came to rescue that lady. That vision has been etched in my mind forever, that you must stand up and literally protect your sisters in society. So it's been a very strong part of life. It's part of what we have done in my pursuit of martial arts. I'm a strong supporter of the martial arts movement and ensuring that people are protected. Those are all physical and spiritual and social attributes. As an attorney general, as a lawyer, my passion and privilege coincide in being able to pass the laws that allow us to protect our women, our vulnerable people in society, and operationalize the policies to make sure that this comes to fruition. So that's a rather long answer to your short question.
Come on, but I like to ask the short answers and the short questions and cut track for Guti to run. But I like the fact that you would have raised the martial arts because whereas you have I don't know how do you quantify the impact that jumping on to something like the Men's Pledge can have? Because one person would have said that, okay, well, like practicing a kata and you'll get these things so that they almost become muscle memory. Is it the same way when you're looking at the pledge and you say, okay, well, you kind of have it in your system so you don't need to think about it as much? How does that work for you?
Well, it's funny that you should draw the connection to the martial arts. Martial arts is about retraining your body, muscle memory based upon practice, but it all starts and springs with awareness. You can't defend yourself successfully unless you are aware of your society, your situation, and that moment in time. So the muscle memory comes after awareness. The Men's Pledge is to create the conscious awareness that you're pledging to strive for something. And the more and more of us in society, men in society, who take the pledge, it starts the mindset of making sure that you're aware of your obligation. And then that obligation has to be practiced so that the muscle memory, the spiritual memory, the social attributes coincide with your awareness.
And is there something that would have jumped out to you specifically in the points along the Men's Pledge that you said, okay, well, this really resonates with me?
Well, of course it resonates with me. The Men's Pledge, let's get simple about it. The men's pledge is men standing up and giving a commitment to participate in life and in our interactions with our women folk in a dignified, decent, and respectful fashion. And that really is as simple as it gets. What grows from there is how you practice what you have pledged. And really, the practice can be brought into life by taking awareness into the situation where you are guided by rules and obligations, laws, processes, and procedures to take us into a different space. There is a need for us to practice what we preach.
Now, who better to speak about narratives and turns of phrases than with the Attorney General of a country? So with that in mind, with that context, how important is it making that distinction, AG, between gentlemen considering themselves heroes and protectors versus being partners and allies?
If we are cognizant of our world, the concept of being a hero is a dangerous one. The concept of being a partner and an ally is perhaps a more appropriate one. Heroism finds itself sometimes in just a mere expression of statement, standing up for what is right, making sure that you say something because it's the right thing to say. Now, none of us are perfect. We live in a world where there's a lot of competition for truth. There's a lot of competition for issue analysis. And in coordinating, bringing this pledge to life, I think that the first thing that we have to recognize is that there is a very different workplace and societal place amongst our young in particular that we have to be conscious of. In the public service, I've noticed, in the Office of the Attorney General, the vast majority of people that work in the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs are women. There is a fracture in the representation of men. Men are being counted now. Where are our men? What are they doing? Is there a societal dynamic that in the absence of men in terms of public service, public life, the teaching service, are we now seeing gender disparity? Is this contributing to the consequences of violence rearing its head, etc.? All of those things step into that whole conversation of hero and partner. Are we going to be courageous enough to recognize that we have to have balance in our issues and that we have to make sure that we protect ourselves, both men and women, from getting the situation ventilated in the wrong way? We have to protect against that. We can't allow for the situation to run astray, and therefore coming back to our pledge, saying these are the rules of engagement. I'll start off by being respectful. I'll start off by committing to stand up for the right cause. These are things that you begin to practice as you move along, recognizing that the zones that our younger people operate in particular, are very, very different from what they used to be, perhaps when I was much younger.
And with that, we are going to take a short break. We are speaking with Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi about his decision to take the men's pledge. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are speaking with Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi about his decision to take the men's pledge. Now, speaking about the men's pledge, just reminding you of those points. Those points are to have peaceful relationships, to value what women say, to treat women with respect, to respect consent, to share the care, and that actually speaks to playing a greater role in household chores and childcare, to hold other men accountable, to spread the word, and to ask for help. Now, among those 8 points, AG, what is the one that really stood out to you and made you say, well, yes?
Well, there's so much in there. I mean, it's going to sound corny, but literally every bell rings for me. I am a big supporter of men participating in family life. For me, my children come first. I'm an unapologetic expert dishwasher and cleaner. So participating in home life and activities are a joy for me. But respect, I mean, understanding that you have to have your respect for consent and for structures. The one thing that triggers me seriously in life is a bully. Perhaps one of the reasons that I even engaged in political life is that I do not support bullying. And bullying can be very multidimensional. Bullying can be compelling people to take your point of view, not respecting the fact that somebody else has a perspective that may be very useful, if not more beneficial. And therefore you have an obligation to listen to it. So, I mean, those tick the box aspects of the pledge are resonating concepts that our society needs. Making sure that consent and other factors, all of these things feed into a lot of the legislation which I have on deck and which the government is promoting. When we're talking about consent, there's a very important piece of law that we want to bring to the parliament to criminalize revenge pornography, sharing of images or situations without consent. Now that, of course, has gender balance attached to it. It is neither for nor against men or women. But when we talk about relevance of consent, that becomes a very interesting touchstone. Another thing attached to the consent aspect are two very important amendments that we're having discussions about. One is about further amendments to the sex offenders registry, and perhaps including a sex offenders charges registry. Another one is looking at the concept of voyeurism, where there is a sexual crime associated with peeping toms and lacking of consent. So consent is perhaps the one that jumps out most, but I really do think that men need to pledge to be part of their family. And being part of your family means being part of changing diapers, education, homework, participating in the home life in every sense and fashion. So I think that all of the bells ring. Consent is a big one for me, features a lot in our legislative reforms. And I do hope that our listening and viewing public will actually have a point of view on these laws when we bring them to the Parliament.
Definitely bringing those laws and bills to the Parliament is one of the things that we want to include in this conversation. But just before we go into that sphere though, you said that almost everyone rings true with you. Is there one that you find a little more challenging than the others? Basically asking the flip side of the question that I previously asked.
I'd probably say no. Learning as you get older in life and the longer you participate in marriage, you will realize that learning the art of not necessarily saying what comes to the top of your mind often brings peace and harmony and perspective. And therefore, consent can be perhaps managed a little bit more broadly about learning when to keep a still tongue. It's very important that we think before we speak and think before we act. That isn't a part of the pledge necessarily, but if you're going to value what women say, and if you're going to treat with women with respect, you have to make sure that you're also learning when you ought to say what you want to say after you have thought about it. Because once the spoken word is released, it becomes something that cannot be retrieved.
And I could imagine there's a potential for individuals in public life to say, okay, well, I don't want to have myself attached to something like this because this opens me up for scrutiny, especially men in public areas of life, public office, having the responsibility on themselves. What would you say to somebody who is going through that kind of thought process?
Well, the first thing that we have to accept is that nobody is perfect. Secondly, none of us can ever pretend to have gotten it 100% right in our lives. As human beings, as persons participating in relationships, be it with our parents, with our siblings, or with our spouses, we're always going to have had those moments of anger or frustration where we may express ourselves inappropriately. So the first thing I'd say is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to admit to humanity or to error. I don't hold myself up as a perfect individual. Far from that be the case. I've made my whopping share of bad decisions, just like everyone else has. In my case, as a person in public life, that's part and parcel of the situation. The only thing in public life that causes me concern is fake news, because very often you can be labeled as having done something which was edited and which is just simply untrue. Those are the bits that may cause you upset or anger. But if you're afraid of participating because you think that you're being held to a perfect standard, or that you may be exploited for something you said this way and that can be said the other way, I wouldn't be worried about that. Have a generous amount of humor in yourself and learn to laugh at yourself. That's a very useful tool in public life.
And continue with public life, or just in terms of your circles, how important do you think it is to have men speak to men about these issues? And I say that because many times when we have another very unfortunate incident, we see men speaking to women and saying, okay, well, you should have worn this or you shouldn't have worn that. You should have used this car instead of this mode of transport. You hear women speaking to the universe saying, don't do this to us, but you don't necessarily hear men speaking to men. How important is it, or what's the significance of a moment like this where you're able to say, okay, well, you have men talking to men about an issue like this?
I think that you've hit the nail on the head. Men speaking to men, which is part of the pledge, communication to our brother, is critical. We have to dismantle some of the inhibitions that we have as men, where we're afraid to admit to being under stress. We're afraid to talk about financial stress, which may be taken home and which may explode. We're afraid to talk about issues that affect sexuality. We're afraid to talk about emotional health. These are things that originally cause and stand as the genesis of a lot of activity that goes wrong and just ends up with tragedy. And it really is very important for men to speak to men, and for men to speak to sons or nephews. I recommend very sincerely uncles in particular being great uncles to their nephews, because sometimes younger men may be a little bit intimidated or ashamed to speak to their fathers. There may be a bit of judgmental attitude that comes in, but having a safe uncle to come and say, listen, this is going on, I'm afraid of this, I'm concerned about that, that tends to find a very good place and a sense of security. So you have more than just the family, meaning the father or the person whom you are with, but you have a trusted uncle or cousin or somebody that you can talk to. So mentorship is a huge part of men talking to men. But guys, we really just need to be comfortable in expressing how we feel and in talking about our fears. What makes you worry? What makes you feel less than manly? It could be a financial situation. It could be a physical condition. All of these are things that we have to really talk about, so that you know it's not abnormal to be feeling a particular way. It's not abnormal to be feeling threatened by the fact that your wife earns more money than you, or that you didn't have the opportunity to support your family well because you lost your job, or that you're in a bad state of physical condition that has affected your sexual health or your life, etc. These are things where we have to take apart these taboos where you can't talk about it, because the truth is, you find a lot more comfort in knowing that you're not alone. And therefore, communication is critical in this regard.
And we also find that we need to take another break. This brings us to the end of the televised aspect of this conversation. For the rest of it, join us on our digital platforms, TTT Live online on Facebook and YouTube. So we thank you for spending the extra time with us, AJ Al-Rawi. But if you are just looking at the televised aspect of this, on behalf of the entire newsroom, thank you for tuning in. Welcome back. If you're with us now, that means you are on the digital side of things, TTT Live Online. We are speaking about the men's pledge against the gender-based violence with Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi. And AG, where do we start? Do we look at it from the personal level, or do we start to address from the policy level, or do we go somewhere in between?
I think we do both. The most important thing is that we start. I genuinely am a very strong advocate of the philosophy of just start. It's the reason why so much reform has actually come to life in the last 6 years. We met as a government decades of planning, structure, arrangements, and we've managed to radically transform by way of implementation on a philosophy of just start a number of things. So let's talk about it in the context of what we're discussing here now. We have to literally look at this in its multiverse. One, the attitude of men starts in the home. There are two homes that some people think about, but there are probably three. The first home is the parental unit or the grandparental unit, person with responsibility for the child. The attitude of the home comes into our young men. The second home that you could look at is the attitude at school, and what you're taught at school resonates with you as you progress in life. But the third aspect is your social engagement. For our very young, it starts with, are you involved in football? Are you in karate? Are you lineman on the block? What your extracurricular pack looks like. We have to get into the mindset of those three places immediately, where we set the rules of engagement. Now, don't get me wrong. I also believe this is not a singular message to men alone. Permit me for being bold, but I believe that we also need to have a conversation with our women as well, because communication also requires respect on both sides. So it is the concept of respect between the gender balance arrangements and societal interactions that really matters. A woman that has a sharp tongue or is met with an aggressive man who is born that way or bred that way, that can be an expressive, explosive cocktail. So let's talk about getting into the mindset of those places. The second thing at the same time is the implementation of the structure of reform. And reform can be driven through legislative or practical steps that make a difference. Do we think that the school curriculum, from a policy perspective, ought to include certain aspects? Do we also believe that the rules of engagement in our laws need to encourage a different form of thinking? I can speak to the law, certainly. I can tell you my colleague, the very hardworking Minister of Education, both ministers in that ministry, Dr. Nian Gatsby-Dolly and Lisa Morris, they are hard at work on the curriculum and other aspects. When we talk to legislation, legislation does have a significant impact on affecting attitudes, which is why some of our legislative products, sexual harassment law, sexual offenses law, which involve, as I had mentioned earlier, criminalizing revenge pornography, criminalizing voyeurism, introduction of a sexual offenders register for charges, introducing bail considerations for very violent sexual offenses, treating with further amendments to the Domestic Violence Act, the whistleblowing legislation, the cybercrime legislation. All of these things have the immediate ability to say that there is a serious consequence which can be immediately delivered if you trip these attitudes. And does it make a difference? Yes, it does. And you need only look at how just start small amendments on our motor vehicle and road traffic laws caused a reduction of a 65-year low in road traffic deaths. And let me remind you, 65 years ago, we're talking about 1950s Trinidad and Tobago, where we still had donkey carts on the road. So for a demerit point system, to go into effect where people are worried about if they're speeding or if their tint is the wrong color, etc., where people are putting on their seatbelts because there's a consequence of an economic fine or demerit point. That's an example of where a simple amendment to the law can bring massive results in attitudes, because there was a point in time where people thought nobody could slow down in Trinidad and Tobago. When we amended that law, people said, well, boy, why did you reduce the speed limit in Trinidad and Tobago? And we had to say, no, we didn't reduce the speed limit. We enforced the speed limit. And that's when people understood the law was 80 kilometers per hour, and then we increased to 100. So I'm giving you examples where law can make a difference if it is properly implemented, as we have done in so many ways in the last couple of years.
Now, I want to validate one of the things you said, specifically, that women need to be brought into the conversation as well. And to that end, CariMAN has also issued 3 points for partners of men who have taken the pledge. And for that information, you can actually visit www.cariman.org. That's cariman.org. But in terms of the amount of legislation that you've just spoken to, AG, what, to your mind, is the need for this increased level of dialogue? You've increased the level of your access to different communities. We see you on Twitter Spaces, we see you on IG, to talk about the law and constitution. What's the need for it, in your view?
So, as an Attorney General for the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, I have spent a lot of time looking at data, and I've spent a lot of time appreciating the realities of Trinidad and Tobago politics. In coming into this office as Attorney General, I vowed to produce data for consumption in the society, which is why I went to the prisons, why I introduced the whole concept of the abolition of child marriage, why I looked at statistics on motor vehicles, I looked at statistics on marijuana, I looked at statistics on domestic violence. I brought statistics because the government is interested in statistics. In looking at the need to have conversations, I have a genuine belief that Trinidad and Tobago has not been spending enough time on issues, and instead we've been focused on personalities. So I've made a very dedicated attempt to broaden the spaces where the Office of the Attorney General can speak to issues of law and society. And as a result of that, we've been engaging in more than days a week, many days a week in multiple spaces, literally speaking with thousands and thousands of people. In one Twitter event, we had over 3,000 people, another one 3,000 plus. And we've gone on to multiple platforms, because what we're talking about has nothing to do with whether you're wearing red, yellow, green, white. We're talking about, are you for or against protecting witnesses? Are you for or against criminalizing revenge pornography? Are you for or against criminalizing domestic violence? Are you for or against treating with sexual harassment? Because if you notice the manner in which I choose to engage in my political conversations as Attorney General, we're very clear in this government that we represent everyone, and the Prime Minister constantly reminds our cabinet of that you are the Attorney General, for example, of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So the Office of the AG has been very dedicated in its attempt to bring us to discussing issues. And I find that that discussion is most productive when you get to the ground, so that there is a groundswell. We see a lot of marches, we see a lot of agitation, we hear people saying, protect our women, do more. But if you ask them, what do you think ought to be done, more than just saying, protect our women, you're very, very, very low on content. That's why the government's obligation has been, I have a list of 22 items legislatively that are ready to rock and roll in September onward. We'll be producing an agenda to that effect, etc. So we have come with specifics. The issue for me is making sure that when the government approaches the parliament, that we are not stymied by a political opposition just for the sake of opposition. We rather have tilled the public soil so that we can get the information into the minds of our citizens so that they call for the success and the passage of the law.
So away from the cut and thrust of representational politics, when you take off your fancy tie, you're out of parliament, and you're on these spaces that are engaging those numbers, what kind of feedback are you receiving from the ground level, from the lay people who are interested in these issues, going to the heart of the issues, AG?
Well, the feedback is phenomenal. First of all, people are astounded by the fact that any government minister, and I'm not the only government minister that does this, many of my colleagues, Randall Mitchell, Shamfa Cudjoe, Foster Cummings is doing a great deal of work on communities, Camille Robinson-Regis, Stuart Young, all of us have taken now to multiple platforms. And the first things first is to recognize that we are servants of the people. What we have to do, and for me in particular, as the drafter of the laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, laws are made for more than lawyers. Laws are made for the people. And having a sense of how the law feels is important. So the response in terms of how you feel about the law, the way in which you think Trinidad and Tobago society is going to be. Where do you see yourself? Where do we see ourselves in the road ahead is the conversation. This is where we are now. Where do we want to go? An example of data put to useful effect. There was a point in this country when we spent $40 million every 2 years. $40 million, it used to be a year. It went down to $40 million every 2 years, $25 million a year in moving prisoners. We now have virtual courts open in the prisons, and therefore that bill is now a negligible sum. So having produced the data in 2015 had a consequence in 2021, where we have redirected resources. And again, you can't perform any task unless you can measure it. And that is the critical aspect of having these conversations, measuring the appetite of the public, measuring the issues, and opening the doors to discussions.
Does doing the groundwork, getting the information to move something forward, make it easier for others? Is there almost like a snowball effect in the right direction, AG?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, when I piloted the law to introduce judge-only trials, there was a song and a dance against it. Nobody would use judge-only trials. Who for murder would ever go before a tribunal without a jury? This is insanity. The opposition didn't support it. Look at how many judge-only murder trials we've done. We just completed the Sean Luke murder trial, judge-only. And in that trial, we had a combination of events. A judge-only trial using virtual evidence, DNA evidence, 9 lawyers appearing from 9 different locations, prisoners appearing from the prison, witnesses appearing from overseas. In one case, we had a policeman who gave evidence from the back of his truck because he became an interstate truck driver in the United States. He gave his evidence from the back of his truck on a camera. Can you imagine that Trinidad and Tobago came to that kind of case management because we passed the law in 2016 and 2018? This wasn't because of COVID. We had built out the law in 2016, and we were faced with massive opposition. So the snowballing of success has come about because we started the job.
I know I don't want to get on like Oliver Twist too much, AG, but lastly, you said that you're ready to rock and roll come September. So what are some of the other things that you have on the agenda to take to the Parliament that you're looking forward to piloting in short order?
So we have some big stuff. If I were to put them into packages, a whole package on the environment. Marvin Gonzalez is settling off on the final issues to deal with our beverage recycling. That is a multi-billion-dollar industry that impacts not only just cleaning the environment and avoiding floods, etc., but it births an industry. We have the whole digitization platform in eliminating paper in further ways. We have a whole package that the AG's office has settled already on that digitization strategy. We have a huge package on gender and protection of the vulnerable. We have the campaign finance reform. We have local government reform. We have the cannabis report that is ready for debate. We have a huge amount of law structured that is going to take us to a better place. Having built a very strong foundation of reform, layering these foundation successes with more structured reform, that's going to be the charge of the next session of the Parliament. And I'm really looking forward to September coming along so that we can start that work.
All right, so some people will say, ask me for anything but time. So Adri, we want to thank you for your time and for taking a stand with the Men's Pledge, as in addition to the other work that you're doing. And on behalf of the entire news team, I'm DK Roster. Thank you for joining us. Have a good one.